got 10 slides, so I should be pretty much sort of in between here. I'll speak at a rate that's right in between. Okay, so yeah, we're going to switch gears just a little bit. It's a sort of a nice follow-up to Peter's talk, and I really just want to focus the next little bit on managing. What do we talk about in terms of management of pediatric concussions? The field of managing concussions, concussion symptoms in children is really still relatively new. We probably know a lot more about the signs and the symptoms than we do about really effective ways and evidence-based ways of managing the symptoms. So, but as much as we have no gold standard, we certainly have a good idea. We have a general understanding. We have guidelines to follow in terms of how to best manage those symptoms. So that's just what I want to go over with you guys right now. I just want to go very briefly over, and this is not, as Peter pointed out, there's no hard data in terms of what we really should be calling the duration of typical symptoms, but if we were to give sort of an estimate for children, typically in children, days to weeks is sort of what we're talking about, but it's certainly very variable and is certainly very unique to each child's situation. For a significant proportion, probably no specific numbers again, but for a significant proportion of children, those symptoms can last longer, and so we're talking about those children who are a bit more slow to recover. And we're looking at symptoms that can go for a few weeks and that can go into months. Several factors that impact how long those symptoms last. When we're talking about how to manage them, really what we need to be taking is this unique approach. This unique approach to managing the particular child's symptoms. A lot of different factors that go into what makes the symptoms last longer or not. The type, the severity, the location of the injury, the type and the severity of the symptoms that they're actually displaying. Any kind of history of previous concussions puts a child at much higher risk of having significantly more intense symptoms. The age of the child, so younger children tend to have a bit of a harder time having symptoms resolve. And any pre-existing conditions, so having to think about, well, we're not going to be managing the attentional issues of a child who's just had a concussion who had significant attention issues before that concussion. We'll be managing them in a little bit of a different way, or we'll have expectations that are tailored to the specific child's needs. Okay, in terms of the symptoms, so we had a nice overview by Peter Anderson. When we're thinking about symptom management, we heard from Dr. Vassiliadou, we had a quick little glimpse about this return to play protocol, and it's typically what people are talking about, and it's what we hear about the most in the news in terms of when we're managing concussion symptoms. We want to set up this return to play protocol, and that's really mainly geared towards gradually reintegrating the child into their normal life, taking most into account the physical symptoms. I believe that Dr. Goulet is going to be speaking a little bit more about the physical symptom piece. So I really want to concentrate most of my talk just on the cognitive and emotional symptoms. In the same way that we really need to think about a return to play protocol, we really need to be focusing on coming up with a return to learn protocol. So we need to come up with a plan that's where we're taking into account the individual symptoms and we're managing the individual child's cognitive and emotional symptoms in the same gradual way. Okay, I included this slide because it really is important to remember that as we're managing a child's symptoms following a concussion, we really need to keep in mind that we need to be communicating and collaborating with everybody involved. So the key players in terms of coming up with decisions about how to manage the symptoms are obviously the child or youth. I'm using child, but encompassing adolescents as well. Parents for sure, any healthcare professionals that are involved, and definitely the school. You need to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of how we're going to help the child recover, and we need to make sure that they're on the same page in terms of what symptoms are we monitoring and what are we trying to tackle, what are we trying to help the child out. Okay. I just want to speak a little bit about, if we think about sort of these more acute symptoms. So we're sort of talking initial hours, first few days. What are we talking about in terms of managing those kind of symptoms? there's general agreement that if you're only going to focus on one thing in those first few hours, those first 2 days, it really is the idea of rest, rest, rest. And we're talking about physical rest and cognitive rest. So it's not just limiting participation in sports and just not going back to your hockey game. You actually should be sitting out the second and third period, but also talking about taking things slowly in terms of reintegrating back into your home activities and your school activities. I just want to touch very briefly on the reason why rest is so important. We saw the images that Dr. Vassiali put up in terms of how the brain actually gets injured with a concussion. One of the things to remember is that the metabolism in the brain actually gets upset by a concussion. So it's really at the chemical level that things are happening. And so in those couple of hours after, in those couple of days after, your brain is really, really working hard to restore its normal metabolism and to restore its normal function. So the more you tax your brain in those first couple of hours after, the less energy you're allowing it to have to actually make a difference and heal itself. I want to focus on this whole idea of cognitive rest, those first few hours and days after. The whole idea of cognitive rest is that we want to limit those overstimulating activities. So unfortunately, things as simple as reading, things as simple as engaging with your friends, texting, computers, video games, all the fun stuff that one would normally fill their day with while they're resting are not actually terribly resting for the brain. So when we talk about cognitive rest as well in those first few hours and days after, it's really what we're talking about. Reassurance is very important in terms of helping out someone who's just sustained a concussion. Reassurance that with proper management, most children do fully recover. And then educating parents and children in terms of what to expect, what symptoms to expect, the typical course, making sure that expectations are realistic, and that it's okay if a couple of the symptoms are lingering. It's not terribly out of the ordinary. Switching gears over to these more persistent symptoms that tend to linger that little bit longer. A lot of the symptoms that we're talking about are the ones that Dr. Anderson highlighted, and again, I want to focus on those, on the cognitive and the emotional ones right now. Just like with the return to play in terms of the physical symptoms, we're really always looking at doing a gradual, graded return to normal activities. So we're not going from, okay, I've got no symptoms, I'm going right back to everything that I was doing before. So this idea of a gradual return is really important. The basic assumption is always that if the symptoms are worsening, if the symptoms are re-emerging, then we've probably taxed the brain a little bit too much. We've probably pushed things a little bit too much, so we want to take a step back. It really is important to teach the child that the return of the symptoms, exacerbation of symptoms, so symptoms worsening, those headaches worsening, them feeling like they're getting even more fatigued as they're returning to activities, that feeling and sensing those symptoms is their guide to how quickly or how slowly we should be returning to activities, to normal activities. So essentially, those symptoms are dictating the speed at which we're going. We really need to teach the children to pay attention to those symptoms, but obviously, we need to take into account the fact that younger children will not be paying as much attention to those because they won't be able to make sense of it. So parents need to really guide those decisions as well. And also then there's always the factor of wanting to get into things more quickly because we're feeling like we've been out of our routine for so long that we don't really want to talk too much about the symptoms. So it really is important to educate the children and the youth about what to expect and what to be in tune with. It's always important to keep in mind and to remind children and youth that have just sustained a concussion that things will likely continue to improve, and that accommodations may be necessary now, but that the accommodations don't necessarily need to be permanent. Okay, so I just want to take a quick look at more specifics in terms of recommendations. I just got one slide up in terms of cognitive symptoms in the home. What are we thinking about? As a general rule, the brain will tell the child when it needs to rest. So if the child is feeling tired, he or she probably should go and take a rest. Again, teaching the child to be aware of their own symptoms as the guide is a good idea. Cognitive rest remains important. You don't want to overstimulate the brain. At the same time, once these symptoms have been persisting for a couple of days and now we're going into a couple of weeks, we're not going to be asking a child or an adolescent to stay away from their cell phone or to stay away from the television or the computer for weeks on end. So there has to be a balance here. You want to reintroduce activities, again, in a gradual fashion. The 15-minute block tends to work. And again, if there are no symptoms, then you continually increase time. Minimizing time-pressured situations is probably a good idea, especially for those children or youth who through neuropsychological assessments or just through general observations seem to be slower, seem to still have that fogginess and harder time sort of getting the wheels rolling. You give them time-pressured situations, and again, you're really putting undue stress on the brain. I put this in, again, think about children having these memory and attentional difficulties getting themselves organized. Cell phones and smartphones can be really handy. So as much as, we talk about making sure to limit their use, there's a certain balance because there can be awesome tools in there. They really can be good memory aids. Just a few recommendations for parents at home. One of your most important roles is to help monitor your child. Simplifying requests, breaking tasks down, making sure that things are not too complex, just again, so that we're not totally overwhelming them. At school, again, what we're talking about is this return to learn plan. So again, one of the most important things is to set up a meeting. If your child is just sustained a concussion, they're looking at reintegrating back into school, set up a meeting with the school personnel and include whoever you feel is important. So teachers, school nurse, counselor, principal, whoever you feel is important. But alert them to the fact that your child has just had an injury and educate them in terms of potential symptoms that we're trying to monitor and that we're looking out for. In terms of attendance, again, gradual reintegration is usually the best idea. For some children who have had more of a moderate to severe head injury, perhaps 1 hour a day is enough at the beginning. Perhaps a half a day they can manage. Perhaps going straight into full days is manageable. But again, look at that gradual reentry. Don't feel the need to, well, if I'm going back to school, I'm going back to school for the 6 hours and I'm doing all of my extracurricular activities from day one. Attending the less stressful classes first is probably not a bad idea either. In terms of specific accommodations, there are lots of things that schools can do, and schools are typically very open and receptive to working with parents and with healthcare professionals and with the child to figure out what's going to work best for them. Specific recommendations can include anything from being exempt from actually making up all the missed coursework they may have missed because of their concussion. Reduced course loads, reduced homework assignments, additional time for assignments, again, just so that we're giving that extra time for children who are slower to respond. And then I put in exempt from standardized tests, which is especially important for children or youth who continue to have symptoms, who continue to have those daily headaches or the fatigue. Okay. Oh, I can't move forward. Maybe we'll talk a bit more about cognitive symptoms at school. Can I go back? No, I can't go back. Technical difficulty. Oh, there you go. There, you just had to show your face. Yeah. Nice. Awesome. Okay, just briefly, other accommodations that could be made within the school, environmental adaptations, factors to consider. You get into the classroom, there are a lot of distractions going on. You don't really want to go sit next to the door, next to the window, or next to the students who love to chat or text or whatever in the back. Sitting up close to the teacher so the teacher can essentially allow for closer monitoring, and so that you're avoiding more of the distractions. Avoiding the overstimulating environments. The school bus can be horrendous in terms of unstructured, overstimulating. So those are the kind of things we want to be thinking about. So it's not just It's not just a sports piece, it's not just within the classroom, but it really is, it can affect all levels of functioning. I'll just quickly, using a locker, avoiding the heavy backpack, and access to class notes for, again, because it can be tedious and it really taxes attention and memory to write down all those class notes, especially for those high school students, university students. Individual education plan I put in here because it really is important to consider for children who have those persisting symptoms. An individual education plan is simply a way of, it's a document that essentially formalizes the need for accommodations and adaptations to the regular school program. It makes it more formal, and it also follows the child for as long as they need. It's not a permanent document that will forever follow them, but for as long as a child needs it, it is there and will be followed by school personnel. I just put in at the end here, you know, for children and youth who have those more severe difficulties, who have really had more of a severe injury, additional professional services may be needed. So we may need to look into more of the psychology services, speech and language services. Those are typically the two professional services that are tapped into. And again, it's targeting, it's trying to help develop those, the symptoms that have been affected. So memory, attention, language issues. So seeking those professional services may be a route to explore if ever the symptoms really are more severe. This is my last slide. Managing the, just touching briefly on the emotional symptoms, the irritability, the sadness, the low frustration tolerance that seems to come with a lot of concussions. Again, the idea of the importance of early education in terms of having realistic expectations about what things are going to look like over the next few weeks. Interestingly, as most of the other symptoms lessen, and as the child reintegrates into their normal activities in the school and in the home, very often a lot of the emotional issues will decrease as well. I put in here focusing on developing these coping strategies and relaxation techniques. So developing strategies to cope with increased feelings of anger, to cope with more of the anxiety that may come with having been out of your routine for a couple of weeks. Relaxation techniques, I just put a few examples in of deep breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, and visual imagery. And I see some smiles in the audience, and I think it's because I included parents in the coping strategies and relaxation techniques. But it really is important because as much as the concussion itself affects the child, a family living with a child with a concussion is greatly affected. So very important for parents who are playing an important role in recovery for their child to remember to find resources for themselves. I put this in brief bouts of exercise mainly because there's huge positive effects on the chemicals in the brain when you exercise, on the chemicals that are responsible for our mental health, for our mental well-being. So again, very much, Dr. Goulet may be touching on this in the next talk, but essentially you want to, I put in the supervise because you don't want to go, it needs to be monitored and it needs to go in conjunction with the other physical symptoms that are occurring. But there certainly can be benefits for the mental health piece, getting into a program that's slowly increasing the exercise. And again, for some children, those symptoms, the emotional symptoms, can be really persistent. They can be really debilitating and can really impact on the child's ability to function in the home and at school and with their friends. And there can be secondary problems that come up that arise from that, basically. Falling, because they've fallen behind the school now, because their life at home has been totally disrupted. Their friendships have been totally disrupted. So there can be a lot of secondary problems that can come with the symptoms that persist for a significantly longer period of time. And if that's the case, then it really is important to liaise with the health professionals that are already involved in terms of looking into whether additional assessments or interventions are necessary from, for example, a psychologist. That's it for my piece.
Okay, so to be fair, I'm not showing any favoritism. That was, in fact, 20 minutes. So. Have a hard enough time cutting off